No, man, I got you. If someone ever proved evolution was wrong, they'd get a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
That's how science fucking works. And, oh man, did I ever tell you I took the philosophy of science class?
It is very popular at Boise State.
Well, I was at U of I, and the teacher was a biologist.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed a bit like random at the time. Like, yeah, any science person could be a philosopher of science, right? Because, it's interesting. No, there's a good reason for the biologist to want to get into the philosophy of science.
Why was that?
Well, you see, one of the very first lessons we had, it was why creationism isn't science.
Okay, that's a good one. I gotta be honest. But the reason that I was immediately suspicious is because, it's pretty bad at Boise State still, I think, from what I've encountered. But there was a time in the 1970s, and fucking Robert Sapolsky goes on and on about this. There was a time in the 70s where the hegemonic principle of evolutionary biology was basically that only the strong survive, and the strong survive because nature is in a constant state of basically capitalist competition. And then, capitalism was obviously the end result of evolution, and they fit together, and it's a naturalization of capitalism. And in the 70s, it was just biologists would just come up with just so stories about animals, and it would be like, we're going to be able to prove with science someday that the reason why the giraffe has such a long neck is so that it can do battle with its rivals. And that was just sort of how they did science, and they called that science, and it's sort of not. And it wasn't until geneticists came along and were like, hey, we can't find any genetic evidence of the shit you're saying.
Yeah, I think she was in fact specifically
a what?
A geneticist, I think.
A geneticist, yeah. Geneticists, they're so funny. Like, eugenics, for example, is still popular in some really egregious circles. But a lot of them are just sitting around waiting for geneticists to prove that non-whites are racially inferior because of their genes. And they keep saying that eventually that discovery will be made. And then
the geneticists are like, what? No.
Geneticists,
no.
Yeah, geneticists are like, chins are an accident. They're a side effect. And it's just like, geneticists are just throwing a wrench in everybody's works. Because everybody was expecting, again, and this is where we started on this whole thing. People were like, eventually we're going to be able to use genetics to examine the things we presuppose are already correct in a scientific way with the new science. And instead, the actual information coming out of genetics just keeps fucking it all up because none of it was true.
Well, specifically with genetics and race, they're like, so, genetically speaking, race is only kind of a thing. Not there's been a lot of genetic movement in our history. And basically, we had this bottleneck 100,000 years ago, and we haven't sufficiently spread out enough to have actual race. We're all too similar. Which is wild.
Well, it's even weirder than that. And people were really upset about what genetics and anthropology had to say about that, which in a lot of ways was basically doing a 180 from the white man's burden to all of a sudden, actually, there's more genetic diversity between two of the average black people than there is anyone and anyone else, regardless of race in the world. Sorry. Everything you think about race is basically wrong. There's nothing about race genetically that attaches itself to any of these other elements within race or within what we consider to be race that's real. Everything is just there's no relationship between the slip malt liquor and black skin melanin genes. That's just not a thing, right? None of it was true. All of it was just people looking for excuses to be racist and refusing to accept that. And lots of them are still doing it. Since that's come up, though, we are going to examine one of the most important pieces of literature ever penned, and it's quite surprisingly brief. The following statement was adopted by the Executive Board of the American Anthropological Association on May 17, 1998, acting on a draft prepared by a committee of representative American anthropologists. It does not
that sounds like a pain.
reflect a consensus of all members, as individuals vary in their approach to the study of race. We believe it represents generally the contemporary thinking and scholarly position of a majority of anthropologists. And you better believe if the anthropologists are about to say what I'm about to read to you, that the sociologists have been screaming it from the rooftops for decades by that point.
By the way, that disclaimer was basically, hey, we wrote this by...
Yeah, well, writing by committee is very important in academia. So, in the United States, both scholars and the general public have been... Ooh, this is very small on the screen. There's no way you're reading this. Let me try and... Why is it... It moved rather than expanding. That's not what I wanted. Will you, Thank you. Okay. In the United States, scholars and the general public have been conditioned to viewing human races as natural and separate divisions within the human species based on visible physical differences. With a vast expansion of scientific knowledge in this century, however, it has become clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. Evidence from the analysis of genetics, e.g. DNA, indicates that most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. The conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another only in about 6% of their genes. This means that there is a greater variation within racial groups than between them. In neighboring populations, there is much overlapping of genes and their phenotypic expressions. Throughout history, whenever different groups have come in contact, they have interbred. The continued sharing of genetic materials has maintained all of humankind as a single species. Physical variations in any given trait tend to occur gradually rather than abruptly over geographic areas. And because physical traits are inherited independently from one another, knowing the range of one's traits does not predict the presence of others. For example, skin color varies largely from light in the temperate areas in the north to dark in the tropical areas of the south. Its intensity is not related to nose shape or hair texture. Dark skin may be associated with frizzy or kinky hair or curly or wavy or straight hair. Maybe not the right word choice. All of which are found among different indigenous peoples in tropical regions. These facts render any attempt to establish lines of division among biological populations both arbitrary and subjective. Historical research has shown that the idea of race has always carried more meanings than mere physical differences. Indeed, physical variation in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them. Today, scholars in many fields argue that race, as it is understood by the United States of America, was a social mechanism invented during the 18th century to refer to those populations brought together in colonial America, the English and the European settlers, the conquered Indian peoples, and those peoples of Africa brought to provide slave labor. From its inception, this modern concept of race was modeled after an ancient theorem of the Great Shang of being, which posited natural categories on a hierarchy established by God or nature. Thus, race was a mode of classification linked specifically to peoples in the colonial situation. It subsumed a growing ideology of inequality devised to rationalize European attitudes and treatment of the conquered and enslaved peoples. Proponents of slavery, in particular during the 19th century, used race to justify the retention of slavery. The ideology magnified the differences among Europeans, Africans, and Indians, established a rigid hierarchy of socially exclusive categories, underscored and bolstered unequal rank and status differences, and provided the rationalization that the inequality was natural or God-given. The different physical traits of African Americans and Indians became markers or symbols of their social differences. As they were constructing U.S. society, leaders among European Africans fabricated the cultural behavioral characteristics associated with each race, linking superior traits with Europeans and negative and inferior ones to blacks and Indians. Numerous arbitrary and fictitious beliefs about the different peoples were institutionalized and deeply embedded in American thought. Early in the 19th century, the growing fields of science began to reflect the public consciousness about human differences. Differences among the racial categories were projected to their greatest extreme when the argument was posed that Africans, Indians, and Europeans were separate species, with Africans the least human and closer taxonomically to apes. Ultimately, race, as an ideology about human difference, was subsequently spread to other areas of the world. It became a strategy for dividing, ranking, and controlling colorized people, used by colonial powers everywhere, but it was not limited to the colonial situation. In the latter part of the 19th century, it was employed by Europeans to rank one another and to justify social, economic, and political inequalities among their peoples. During World War II, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler enjoyed the expanded ideology of race and racial differences, and took them to a logical end, the extermination of 11 million people of inferior races, and other unspeakable brutalities of the Holocaust. Race thus evolved as a worldview, a body of prejudices that distorts our ideas about human differences and group behavior. Racial beliefs constitute myths about the diversity in the human species and about the abilities and behaviors of people homogenized into racial categories. The myths fused behavior and physical traits together in a public mind, impeding our comprehension of both biological variations and cultural behavior, implying that both are genetically determined. Racial myths bear no relationship to the reality of human capabilities or behavior. Scientists today find that reliance on such folk beliefs about human differences in research has led to countless errors. At the end of the 20th century, we now understand that human cultural behavior is learned, conditioned into infants, beginning at birth, and always subject to modification. No human is born with built-in culture or language. Our temperaments, dispositions, and personalities, regardless of genetic propensities, are developed within sets of meanings and values that we call culture. Studies of infant and early childhood learning and behaviors attest to the reality of our cultures informing who we are. It is a basic tenet of anthropological knowledge that all normal human beings have the capacity to learn any cultural behavior. The American experience with immigrants from hundreds of different language and cultural backgrounds who have acquired some version of American cultural traits and behavior is the clearest evidence of this fact. Moreover, people of all physical variations have learned different cultural behaviors and continue to do so as modern transportation moves millions of immigrants around the world. How people have been accepted and treated within the context of a given society or culture has a direct impact on how they perform in the society. The racial worldview was invented to assign some groups to perpetual low status, while others were permitted access to privilege, power, and wealth. The tragedy in the United States has been that the policies and practices stemming from this worldview succeeded all too well in constructing unequal populations among Europeans, Native Americans, and peoples of African descent. Given what we know about the capacity of normal humans to achieve the function within any culture, we conclude that present-day inequalities between so-called racial groups are not consequences of their biological inheritance, but products of historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances. There are still people I struggle with on a regular basis that cannot handle that.
Yeah. Do you want me to tell you the best racial study I've ever? It's I call it the German bastard, and by bastard I mean the literal definition. So during World War II, a bunch, obviously, and a bunch of them fucked, because obvious. So they took the children of American white GIs and the children of American black GIs, all born in Germany.
We're not getting most of what you're saying.
Oh, you're not kidding me?
Nope.
Damn, I was talking about the German bastards.
Some of it was definitely interesting. There were funny words in there, for sure. But, and I think I get the gist.
So basically, IQ was, I think, 0.5 from the descendants of black guys.
What?
So, was I cutting out, or is
Yep.
that just confusing?
Yep.
Okay. Well, that's a problem.
I don't know what to do about it either.
Indeed, other than switch back to my other computer. Say, what's Miriam's cooking status?
Yeah, I think she'd probably have eaten by now.
Is she still chatting at you on the Twitch?
She said that it sounded really cool.
What sounded cool?
That's a good question. Maybe she'll answer it, who knows.
I hate it when my wrists are fucked up.
Dave's on too? All three of us are on at the same time? My God. And none of us have an awful lot of viewers at the moment either. I don't know, man. So we might end up rating Theory Creep. They're getting the Dangerous Maybe. The Dangerous Maybe does translations of French Marxist philosophy.
Ooh.
Particularly Bourdieu, and Bourdieu is like my dude. Bourdieu is one of the most important social theorists that I work with, and they're super cool. And they're doing something special for Lacan's birthday.
Is Bourdieu the simulacrum guy, or was that?
That's Baudrillard. Bourdieu was on his dissertation committee, though.
Ah.
They knew each other. He was one of the students. And as I recall, Bourdieu might have been Foucault's student. Is that the case? I think that Professor Blaine said something about that at one time. Which would be amazing, because three of the most important thinkers in...
I still haven't differentiated Foucault from anyone else. Like, Baudrillard, if I remember his name. I got the simulacrum. I kind of get him.
Well, I mean,
right?
you have to be interested in Baudrillard once you find out about him, because Baudrillard is very interesting. And is that sort of character. Like, everybody's like, oh yeah, Baudrillard, he says crazy shit. And everybody wants to get in on Baudrillard's crazy shit about simulacrum simulation, hyper-reality, and all this other shit that he goes on about. But it's very, very difficult to get into and understand. And I don't recommend it for anybody that's not very much steeped in philosophy and the history of postmodern philosophy, because, I mean, sometimes he just fucking says shit. You have to figure it out for yourself. That's something that Nietzsche does too. Nietzsche pisses me off when he does that.
Fun fact, all of the actors...
All of the what?
Baudrillard.
All of the what?
Hello? Actors in The Matrix?
Yes.
They were required to read Baudrillard, and like most of them were like, "What the fuck is this?" And then the guy who played, I got it. This makes perfect sense. Why the fuck are you all confused?
Yeah, Simulacrum and Simulation is not an easy read. And a lot of the reason why it's not an easy read is because it references a lot of things without explaining what the things being referenced are. If you weren't in France in 1970, there are whole chapters of that book that are useless to you.
My biggest problem with Baudrillard is he doesn't think language is just a background.
When he uses the term simulacrum, he is using it in a very specific context, which would mean that language couldn't be that, because it's simulacra, as he's talking about them, are artifacts of the postmodern condition. And language is not, in and of itself, postmodern. Quite the opposite.
Well, yeah.
In fact, in a lot of ways, it's language losing its basis in reality that leads to things like simulacra.
Well, okay, so if you're defining simulacra as things that are just symbols of other things...
That's not sufficient. Baudrillard's simulacra are things which have become in no way connected to those things which they were originally meant to represent. They've taken on a sort of life of their own. They've reached an apotheosis where they are their own thing and no longer reference the thing that they were designed to reference.
So if it was in language, it would be like specifically fucking. Rarely do you think of sex when you say fucking.
I think about sex all the time.
Well, yeah, but you're you.
So here's the thing. Like, let's say that you're driving into town, and there's the entering the town sign, and it has the population on it. All right, somebody drops an experimental weapon of mass destruction onto that town, and eradicates all life and all buildings in that town, and the freeway that leads to it. So you're driving down this road, and then all of a sudden, at this sign, there's just nothing past it. And you drive up to this sign and you stop and you're like, whoa, look at the level of incredible devastation on the other side of this sign. And then that sign, you're like, well, this sign is here and this has meaning because I used to live in this town. I knew people who were there. And so people start putting like memorials or flowers and stuff at that sign in order to commemorate the people who were lost in the attack. So that sign is not accurate. That sign does not represent the city of blah, 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 population blah, 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 because that city is a crater and those people are dead. There is no population. Yeah. But the sign still has some kind of representation. And to people born in later generations who never knew any of the people who died, that sign will continue to have meaning. But that sign's meaning is not what it was designed for. And at that point, that sign would become a simulacrum. That sign would represent in and of itself only itself. No longer would it have the representation to the thing to which it was once attached.
We bitched at her.
It looks like Dave is wrestling with Discord again.
There, I typed at her.
Anyway, I wanted to read that thing because it's very important. I think that I'm going to pull that out, make it a clip, and then do a brief video, very, 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 very brief video about it. Because that's content, get that up there. And I use it in the original version of the paper that I'm reading this book for, which is defining otherness, is what it's called, and that's basically the type of the project as well, to give definition to the concept of other as it exists in philosophy and sociology.
Mary says she's eating.
Yeah.
Like present.
That's cool. I think I've given up on doing the campaign diary thing anyway. I'm gonna wait until Dangerous Baby shows up, and then we'll raid Dave.
Alright, well in that case, I'm going to switch over back to the big computer. It's getting kind of late anyway, and there's less sound interference. And the sun's going down.
Yeah.
So, I'll be right back again.
The sociologist begins to do philosophy to the extent that he takes it on himself not simply to note down facts, but rather to understand them. At the stage of interpretation, he is himself already a philosopher. This means that the professional philosopher is not disqualified from reinterpreting facts which he has not himself observed. If these facts say something different from or something more than the scientists saw in them. As Husserl put it, the edict of the philosophical order did not begin with phenomenology, but with Galileo. Reciprocally, the philosopher has the right to read and interpret Galileo. This separation that we are arguing against is just as damaging to philosophy as it is to the development of science. How can a philosopher with some degree of awareness seriously propose that philosophy be prohibited the company of science? For in the last analysis, philosophy always has to think about something. The square drawn in the sand, the donkey, the horse and the mule, the cubic foot of volume, cinnabar, the Roman state, the hand plunged into iron filings, ellipse. The philosopher thinks his experience and his world. Those are examples of things to think about, right? Or is Merleau-Ponty fucking with me? Philosophy always has to think about something. Well, that's a colon. So yeah, this is a list of examples. Colon, the square drawn in the sand, the donkey, the horse and the mule, the cubic foot of volume, cinnabar, the Roman state, the hand plunged into iron filings, ellipses. The philosopher thinks his experience and his world. How, save by an arbitrary edict, could he be given the right to forget what science says about the same experience and the same world? What the collective noun science refers to is nothing more than a systemative arrangement, a methodological exercise, broader or narrower, more or less far-seeing, of the same experience that begins with our very first perception. Science is a set of means for perceiving, imagining, and ultimately living, oriented towards the same truth, whose necessity is established in us by our first experiences. It may be that science purchases its precision at the cost of a certain schematization. But the remedy for this is to confront science with the integrity of experience rather than to oppose to it a philosophical knowledge that comes from God knows where.
So just to be clear, when he said schematization, he meant like schema, right?
Yes.
Okay. I do have a question for you.
What's that?
So I have in front of me 5 little bottles of vodka, and I am paralyzed with indecision. They are citron, normal, grapefruit, lime, and mandarin.
Why? Why do you even possess them?
I get them for Christmas.
What would Merleau-Ponty do?
Bad. I can still drink them in April. Also, for the record, he's not wrong, but he's also not right. Science, the collective noun, refers to both a body of knowledge and a process. And also kind of the people who do it.
You know what? Since you mention it, it is interesting that Merleau-Ponty isn't talking specifically about what we call the scientific methodology, right? There's references to things that sound like they could be that you could be talking about that he could be talking about hypothesis testing, but doesn't say that. And I wonder why that might be the case. But I think it's more like sort of the argument states that it's an intellectual process that is being differentiated, and that science is an intellectual process that is being differentiated from philosophy.
I arbitrarily chose the grapefruit one, and it's pretty good.
That would probably be the least likely choice for me. That is not one that I would drink. That's not true. I would drink it. That would not be my first choice, for sure.
Look, if you had 5 in front of you, the grapefruit would be the last one. I got you.
Yeah.
Also, it fucks up, like, everyone's meds. I'm not sure if that counts for the vodka version of grapefruit, but grapefruit will fuck up your meds.
Whatever.
Almost universally. The only
about
thing
that.
more universal than fucking up your meds than grapefruit is activated charcoal. Don't drink activated charcoal if you're going to take meds.
So why is that set wrong to begin with? It looks like everybody's more or less done with all this. So, are we cool with rating theory plead, or should we go on with something else here?
So, unless Miriam's gonna pop into voice, and quite frankly, I don't think it matters if she pops into voice at this point. We can totally raid theory plead, and like it's just gonna be a chat over there.
What does chat have to say?
Currently it's empty.
Chat, discuss what, if you want me to keep reading Phenomenology, if you want to go over the Dungeons and Dragons campaign diary for the Sea Nail, or if we're going to raid theory plead now. Don't do decision while I pee. Like, comment, subscribe, and share.